Hi, I'm Mana Moini, and you're listening to the Humanity Podcast. Today is a special episode. I wanted to take some time to talk about an important event that's just happened in our society, the 2024 presidential election. Politics aside, this episode is about how we move forward no matter what side you're on, specifically about how we are able to have respectful, meaningful, and kind conversations in the weeks and months ahead. My hope is that the topics and tools discussed today is something that you, the listener, is able to incorporate in all types of conversations in your life. My guest today is a nationally renowned lawyer and legal political analyst. He was also named the 2022 Outstanding Lawyer of the Year by the Minnesota State Bar Association. Joining me for this conversation is my friend and political analyst guru, Abou Amara. Abou Amara, thank you for being here.
Mana, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it. I know you are very busy.
Busy, but you always make time for your family.
So we just had a big election.
We did.
Lots of emotion. We've talked about it. So today's episode is not political in nature. It's more about how do we have respectful and meaningful conversations in the weeks and months ahead in our society, and hopefully whatever we talk about, people can utilize in other conversations that they have in their life.
For me at least, I feel like so much of our politics is dehumanizing, or it's distilled to important issues, right? We should be having thoughtful debate, vigorous debate. But ultimately, when we make decisions as a society, I think we have to remind each other of one another's humanity. And to be able to say, you know what, we've survived difficult things before. We've gone through a civil war as a country, right? We've gone through a revolutionary war as a country. And so, I think about, as much as you may not want an election to go one way or the other way, reminding ourselves that we've been through difficult times before. And the way we got through those was by leaning into each other and to learn and listen and to understand. And I hope we can continue to do that again.
Absolutely. Before we really get into the nitty-gritty, I want you to tell the listeners a little bit about Abou and how you got into the whole political analyst, commentator part of your life.
Yeah. So I'm the child of immigrants from West Africa, Sierra Leone. And I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin. So my mother immigrated from Sierra Leone to Madison, Wisconsin. So I grew up there. And I remember at a very young age being just kind of civically minded or thoughtful about the world around you, right? Your community, what's happening, why is it happening, what things need to change. And so for me, politics was never just about kind of like team blue or team red or winning. It was really about caring about your community. And so early on, I remember at a young age knocking on doors, asking people to sign petitions, and that carried on throughout my life in college, and then ultimately moving here to the Twin Cities. And so I worked on a presidential campaign and began to learn the Twin Cities, right? Because I'm not from here, but this is now 10 years ago, and so I learned a lot about Minneapolis by literally knocking on doors, talking to people in the community, asking them what they cared about. And I think that's one of the best ways to learn a city is through the lens of its people.
What fascinates you about politics?
Yeah, for me, I think it's this constant conversation, right? That, politics, at its worst can be fighting all the time, but at its best, it can really be a constant conversation about who we are, who we want to become, what are our hopes, what are our dreams, what are our aspirations, and how do we navigate the difficulties to get there together. And so the idea of always having a conversation to me is so important because any problem you want to solve in your life starts with having that conversation.
You are a distinguished lawyer. Are there any parallels between what you see in politics and what you see in law?
100%. I think in law, you are always having to put forth the best argument, right? You're always having to navigate a set of rules that you may not agree with, but you understand why they exist. And you're navigating personalities. And so much of the law really applies to the world of politics, because you're navigating personalities, you're navigating egos at times, you're navigating hopes, dreams, aspirations, you're understanding the opposition. There's a lot of parallels between the law and politics.
Okay, we're going to get into it. Why did this election feel like it was the most divisive one that I can ever remember? Is it social media? Is it we just stopped listening to one another? Or like, what is it?
Yeah, I think it's two things. So one, I think social media is really reinforcing some of the worst aspects of politics. It really becomes an othering, right? It used to be that you would have conversations about politics at a dinner table with people you loved. So the space was safe. There wasn't a place for judgment. And so even when you disagreed, you knew the other person was good, they were kind, they cared about your best interest, and they wanted the best for you. And so I think in that safe environment, you don't take disagreements as personal, or you don't look down on people because they think differently than you. And I think social media is actually separating that conversation. And when you separate those conversations, I think you get into the place where you try to dehumanize or to think someone is inferior, right? It's easier to make an enemy of someone that you're not sitting next to, know, have experienced. And so I think that's a big factor. And then I think the second piece is we're not listening as much as we are talking. As I get older, I realize I talk too much, maybe don't listen enough, right? But one thing I think we've got to do a better job of is actually closing our mouths and opening our ears. We've got 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, I think. And it's because we should be listening more than we are speaking. And I think each of us, myself included, can do a better job of listening to those who we, on paper, vehemently disagree with, to try to understand the perspective that they're coming from.
I just had a conversation with a friend about this topic of what you consume on social media. For most of us, is what the algorithm then continues to show you. And a lot of what you find, especially around politics, is always kind of doom and gloom. Mm-hmm. And I think that's another layer to it. So not only do you not know the other person, so there's no safety, and you feel like you can just kind of go back and forth, but the idea of everything seems so doom and gloom is really an interesting one. And then, you're consuming it and the algorithm just keeps giving you that.
100%. And on top of this, so I could not agree more with that. And I would say the way in which we consume now is so siloed, right? It used to be, and I'm not saying this is good, but I think it was real. In the 1960s or 70s, you would turn on the TV, Walter Cronkite would be on the TV, everybody would be watching it. So we'd have a shared reality, right? And now if you're consuming it on social media, there could be a million different silos, right? So we can't even agree on the baseline of truth to then be able to have our conversation. And so I think that's another layer, I think, that you rightly point out.
And I think sometimes facts, and this doesn't make sense because facts aren't supposed to change, but they seem to change daily, weekly, especially leading up to big events like an election. And that can also add to just the confusion, I think. And then just the fact that you just mentioned, there's not one source where we feel like, okay, we're going to go here and get the actual information.
Exactly. It used to be, again, like I could not agree more. It used to be, okay, we agree on these facts. Now, what does that mean? Where do we go from here? Now we're fighting over the facts themselves, which I think gets us into this place where if all we do is fight over the facts, we can't even get to where we want to go together with those facts.
How do we have the respectful and meaningful conversations coming out of this election? Thanksgiving's coming up.
Yeah.
And although you said, most of us feel safe having conversations at our dinner tables, I think times have changed. There's a lot of divisiveness, even within families and broader, not just your immediate, but the not so immediate families. How do you recommend people go about having those conversations when they get not just to Thanksgiving, but leading up to it?
Yeah. I'm thinking about Thanksgiving too, and how I'm going to have some conversations. I think the first thing each of us can do is operate from a place of curiosity and operate from a place of safety. And what do I mean by that? If you anticipate you're having a political conversation with someone you disagree with, one of the first things I'm going to try to do is actually speak to them isolated, alone, just one-on-one, and say, hey, I'd love to pick your brain on why you think the election went this way or it went that way, and what were the things that you think motivated you? Because I often find the energy of curiosity is one that is disarming. It is one that actually invites somebody else into the conversation, not from a place of judgment, but from a place of true collaboration. You're trying to reach a shared understanding. And so I think that first energy is important, right? So how do you interact from a place of curiosity with somebody else? And then the second thing is to acknowledge, even if it's the smallest minute thing, to acknowledge someone else's reality. I think affirming someone else's reality is something, again, that can disarm, that can help build a feeling of collaboration. And I think those are the foundations. Those are the kind of essential ingredients. So I think if you set the foundation right on that, you can get to other places or spaces that are more collaborative, that are more positive, that even if you disagree, you're at least allowing somebody else to understand your worldview in a less agnostic, less agitated type of way.
So less about, here's what I think, hear me out.
Exactly.
And more the curiosity of, help me understand, what brought you to vote the way that you did.
Exactly. It's less on the substance and it's more on the experience you have with somebody when you're talking about politics. Because if the experience is safe, people will actually engage you in the substance. But if the experience is initially problematic, you're never going to get to the underlying substance. So I think each of us need to focus more on how do people experience politics, not just the issues, although the issues are very important, but that experience that they have is just as important. And that's one thing each and every one of us can do. Look inward and say, how do I contribute to the experience that those around me have with politics?
And to your point, I think the experience is so triggering for so many because of not having the right experience for so long, that anytime politics comes up, even in the last 6 months, everybody's like super nervous to have a conversation. And that just adds to that feeling of not feeling seen or heard or whatever it might be.
Exactly. That feeling to me is a combination of individuals feeling like they're afraid to hurt others. It's a feeling of maybe lack of information. It's a feeling of, I don't want to disrupt what's happening. Instead of, let's focus on empowering people so they feel like they have contributions to the conversation. Let's focus on making sure people feel safe and validated in their beliefs, because when they feel validated, they're thinking to themselves, okay, this is a space where I have a contribution, right? And I think often politics, those conversations, if people feel like they don't have a contribution, why would they engage in that conversation at all, right? And so, again, I think the experience is really where we need to focus our efforts. It doesn't mean we're not going to have vehement disagreements in the future. We should. That's important. But I do think there's something in the breakdown of the experience of politics that I think is detrimental to the future of this country, but also to the people in our communities, because the core of everything is our relationships. It is how we experience those relationships. And politics should be no different.
So question for you. You alluded to listening being an important part of the conversation, which is exactly where I wanted to go with this conversation. How do we practice being good listeners? And how do we know if someone is listening?
Ooh, good. I love the second question. I'll start with the first. How do we practice listening? So for me, it takes an intentional mindset. I am, as you know, and many people will know, I have a couple of opinions, and I'm thoughtful, and I am loud at times. I'm obnoxious at times. But I think the first thing is establishing kind of an internal protocol. How do you make sure you are intentional about listening? So one thing I do, and I do this not here in other spaces, I literally will hold my leg. I will physically hold my leg and pause myself as someone is speaking. Because that is how I remind myself, not just in theory, but in practice, how do I become a better listener, right? So if I'm intentionally remind myself, no, this is not actually the time, Abou, to contribute. This is the time to take in information. So I think for each of us, it's going to be different for different folks. But how do you establish an internal protocol that forces you and reminds you and reinforces that I am in listening mode in this moment? I think is important. That's going to look different for everybody, but that's how I do it for me. That's a mini example. And then how do we know others are listening? I try to the best of my abilities, and I'm not sure I'm perfect at this at all, is I try to restate back to others what I'm hearing. And so you've asked me two questions. You've asked me, how do I become a better listener? And then how do I know others are listening? me saying that back to you, I'm attempting to hear you, understand what you're saying, address what you're saying, and then ask you, is that in fact what you were asking me? Right? So I think, again, it's about being intentional, but if we have internal processes about how we are accountable to ourselves in listening, I think those are the ways we truly know we are in fact doing the best we can. And then when it comes to if I know others are listening, I try to give them information back so that they have a sense that, okay, this person is hearing what I'm saying.
I'm sure you know this, but oftentimes we are so busy thinking about what our response is going to be that we don't hear what people are saying. And so it's almost like being very intentional is very important. So I'm glad that you mentioned, you hold your leg or whatever it might be. It's like, it's so easy to think, again, to go back to what you want to prove and what you want to say, but really being intentional about listening, I think, is so important. And sometimes when you listen to someone's words, there is another step. They could be different than what they're actually meaning, right? So it's deciphering, what is this person saying, but also what do they mean, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of us struggle with communicating. I mean, that's the truth, especially when it's topics that have conflict or topics that are tougher, like politics. Sometimes it's tough to really communicate what we're trying to communicate, but the body language and the inflection in the voice, if we're truly listening, we can kind of dig in deeper
100%.
With people.
And you follow up with questions. That's what I mentioned earlier about curiosity. Often you say, well, I disagree with X or I disagree with Y. There's not much learning to be taking place when you make statements like that. It's like, okay, I guess we disagree. Instead of, well, why do you think that? Or introduce a new piece of information and say, how does that impact how you think about it? I think we make too many declarative statements. We don't pose enough questions, because I think you can learn just as much from your own question as the answer that somebody else will give you to that question. And so I try to the best of my abilities to ask questions to understand someone's perspective. I don't try to make declarations. Even if we disagree at the end, that's okay. But I would like everybody to ask yourself, when you make statements in politics, what are you hoping to get across? Are you hoping to get across understanding? Are you hoping to get across shame? Are you hoping to get across the other person is incorrect, right? If you ask yourself that question, I think it'll help inform how you try to have dialogue in politics.
Love that. So one of the things people always say when they have conversations where they don't agree, both sides don't agree, mm-hmm. It always kind of feels like it ends with, let's just agree to disagree.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this statement and I'm like, I don't even know what that means. Does that mean I'm going to think you're wrong and you're going to think I'm wrong and there's no resolution? Like, that doesn't feel like that's good for humanity as a whole. What are your thoughts on that statement and what do you think it means?
Yeah. I think so. I've had a lot of those similar conversations. To me, agreeing to disagree can mean two things. The first is, I don't think I want to put the energy into understanding your perspective. And if that's the case, I think that can be a bit problematic, especially with our intimate relationships, friendships, and others, because I think the ultimate sense of safety, security, love, affection is understanding, right? And so I'd hope we could, the second category is where I think some folks mean, but they don't say. I think they mean, let's agree to misunderstand each other now, but hopefully we can come back to a sense of understanding, right? So in other words, agree to understand, right? That's what I think the second category should be. And so for that group of folks, I hope it means when we get into a point of tension in political conversation, how do we, again, look inward and say, okay, I want to contribute to this experience being a positive experience about talking about politics. How do I reach this person or disarm this moment, right? And then have the dialogue, right? So again, this goes back to that point about the experience of politics. So to me, agree to disagree, if it means I'm not going to put the energy into it, to me that's problematic because it actually means I'm not committed to understanding you. It means I think I understand you and I'm done talking to you about this topic. And I think that's a bit problematic. But If they mean the other one, the good one, then I'm rocking with you. I got you.
Good thing you and I never disagree.
We never disagree. And when we do, I'm wrong, right? No, I'm just
There you go. You got it. No, you mentioned personal relationships, and this might be a little controversial, but do you think that people in romantic relationships or even friendships can truly be together if their core values are different? For example, if they're on different sides of the political spectrum.
Yeah. So I would say if your core values are different, that may be a problem. If your politics are different entirely, I think some of the most fun relationships are where you have political disagreements.
Do they ever cross, though? Because some core values are also part of the political spectrum.
That is a good point. Then I think each of us have to define for ourselves what are our core values. What are things we cannot negotiate away? You know, if X policy or Y policy is not just politics to you, but it is at your core as a human, then you have to make sure that is non-negotiable. I would just say generally, I think in our world today, people think, oh, you're team red or you're team blue, and therefore I can't date you. I actually think that's problematic as well. To me, it's a form of bias. It dehumanizes people because we associate a particular party with a human, and to me, that is the definition of bias. I think you want people who are different than you. You want people who see things differently than you. You want someone who understands things that you don't understand, your blind spots. So there is a Venn diagram, if you will, right? Some politics are values, no question. And for individuals, they got to define that for themselves. But there's a lot of room for political disagreement that I think is actually healthy for relationships. And I think if we shy away from those conversations, we are not committed to understanding our partner or understanding how to positively engage in communication.
I absolutely agree with you. I think the more we're siloed in our relationships or our friendships around people that only think like us and only believe like us, we're doing everybody a disservice.
Exactly. If you think you're right 100% of the time, you got to look in the mirror because you're not. None of us are 100% of the right time. We always have something to learn from others, and that extends also into the political space.
Absolutely. So at this point, for somebody coming out of this election who's feeling, worried, nervous, fearful, or excited, what do you recommend for somebody that wants to get involved to either help feel better or is excited to get involved? Like, what are some things that people can do now or over the next couple of months? Is it volunteering? Is it getting involved in the offices of people that have been elected? Like, how do people get involved or feel a sense of control, for the lack of a better word, moving forward?
Yeah. So, it's a good question. It's an important question. I think after the election, obviously, the dust has settled. We know what's happened. We know where we're moving forward as a society together. I think there's just two really kind of baseline important things people should do. One, people should be talking to others. Often the election is like, oh my God, and I lost, and I'm so sad, and I'm in a corner. I guess that's important. Or if you're really excited, that's great. But the election is just a checkpoint. It is not the end game. Remember when I said at the beginning, it's a forever conversation? Part of what I think we have to do is to continue the conversation. That was about candidates. Now we should be having conversations about issues. What's important to you? Is it important to you that, whether it's a super local issue like streets being clean, schools, or if it's, issues abroad and foreign affairs and wars, whatever those issues are, channel the next level of energy into those issues and having dialogue with folks who share your values, but also with those who don't, to try to understand those issues better. So to me, it's really, the work doesn't change. It's just the nature of it changes from candidates into issues.
What are you most excited about in terms of just the future?
I am excited about the fact that out of the most difficult circumstances can come some of the greatest innovations, opportunities, and successes. And so I think although there's great tension in this moment in our country, the polling suggests we're highly divided, I do think with every crisis is an opportunity. And so the optimist in me says, how can we channel this energy into something positive moving forward? And I think that, that's the story of America, right? I think it's both tragedy and triumph. It's pain and purpose. And so I think that story is going to continue. I'm just an optimistic person. And so I think these challenging times out of it are going to come some of the most creative, thoughtful, innovative people, ideas, and things moving forward.
I love the positivity in that.
You got to be positive. You got to be positive.
Absolutely.
Life is way too short.
Realistic, but positive.
Exactly.
As you know, the theme for this season is showing ourselves kindness so that we can better show up for our lives, our communities, our relationships. It's really a ripple effect. In that vein, I wanted to ask you a question that we've been leaving everybody with, which is, how do you show yourself kindness, especially on the days that are more difficult?
That's a great question. I would say I show myself kindness in two ways. By holding myself deeply accountable for the things I say, both publicly and elsewhere, and the mistakes that I've made. And as I move forward, holding those with me, but not allowing them to make me feel so bad about them, right? We're humans, we make mistakes. And politics is no different. We all make mistakes. There are people who've learned from voting for X candidate or Y candidate. And maybe they said, oh gosh, I really regret that decision to vote for that person or that person. Give yourself space and grace to say, you know what, I did the best I could in that moment. I'm equipped with more information. How do I make a decision now moving forward that can be a bit better than yesterday? And so to me, we're all just continuous projects. We're all trying to grow and evolve and learn. And so, for those folks, if they feel like they've made a mistake or they feel like they've been hard on themselves, to not forget that, to hold that truth, but to also hold the space for your own enlightenment and development as a human. And if we can hold those two things together, I think that's how all of us are going to become better moving forward.
You are so right. We are not defined by our mistakes. And oftentimes we dwell on them and they become almost a form of shame unless we really deal with them. Thank you so much for being here today, Abou. I think some of the things you hit on is so important as we kind of navigate through the next couple of weeks and months. And some of the things that you said, I'm, even going to do in my personal life and personal conversations outside of politics. I think it's really important to listen. It's really important to be curious. I love that concept. And I can't wait for people to hear it.
Mana, I'm so grateful that you had me. And this platform is so important, I think, for having exactly this type of conversation. So I think in many ways, this podcast emulates what the topic is today. And I'm grateful for this.